The Imperatritsa Mariia was a Russian dreadnought built for the Imperial Russian Navy in the 1910s, and more specifically, the Black Sea Fleet. The dreadnoughts of the class followed along similar lines to their larger Baltic cousins, the Gangut or Sevastopol-class. There were differences between the two, notably their size and length. The Empress Maria, apologies for butchering the Russian name, was armed with 12 305mm or 12-inch 52 caliber guns in triple turrets along the centerline of the ship, and with a top speed of 21 knots, she was certainly a match for any ship in the Black Sea. However, on October 20th, 1916, she was destroyed by an internal explosion in the forward magazine while moored in Sevastopol harbor, killing 227 men in the explosion and her eventual sinking. The wreck was partially raised in November 1917 and fully raised in May 1918, where she was taken into dock with little work carried out and eventually scrapped in 1926. In January 1910, there were reports from the Russian naval attachés in London and Constantinople that reported the Ottoman Empire was ordering dreadnoughts from the United Kingdom, this being the Reshidia or the eventual HMS Aran and a possible sister ship. Although these rumors and reports from the attachés were premature, the threat of a rearming Ottoman Empire to Russia was something that was intolerable to the Russian people and government. Although the Naval Ministry had no intentions of building new battleships for the Black Sea Fleet, there was nothing the Naval Ministry could do to change the people's minds or the government's, and essentially, against their will, they were forced to look into designs for the Black Sea dreadnought battleships. The Naval General Staff proposed a set of characteristics, the first being speed. Speed was not as important as compared to the Sevastopol-class because these new ships were confined to the Black Sea. A top speed of 20.5 or 21 knots instead of 23 was perfectly fine. It meant they could devote more time and resources to heavier guns or armor. Turret armor was increased to 250mm from the 200 on the Sevastopol-class, and the elevation of the guns was increased by 5 degrees. Different turret configurations were considered. However, the Naval General Staff decided they liked the unique linear arrangement of the turrets, with all of them remaining on the centerline at the same level. There were improvements to the turrets, making them roomier for the crews, and it should be noted that when the British had the ex-Emperor Alexander III in 1919, they were extremely interested in the turrets, as they wanted to use the triple turrets on capital ships. The secondary battery was increased from 102mm to 130mm, or from 4 inches to 5.1 inches in casemates on either side of the ship, due to the increasing size of destroyers. With these rough estimates, the design was handed over to the Duma or Parliament for approval. The 102 million ruble bill was approved and then signed into law in May 1910, which authorized the construction of 3 battleships, 9 destroyers, and 6 submarines for the Black Sea Fleet. Since we haven't discussed Russian ships all too much on the channel, something important to understand is that in Russia, especially in the Imperial past, the design and construction phase gets a little weird. I mean, look at these circular monitors from the 1870s. And even between different ships of the same class, there can be some serious differences between them, because different decisions were made between the dockyards and the naval staff. In this case, the first radical and unique idea was from the chief inspector of shipbuilding, who thought that they should replace the machinery with diesels, a very forward-thinking idea. It was estimated that they would save 3,000 tons and allow 14-inch guns to be used on the battleships. The idea was eventually rejected as it was not practical, and debates continued at a somewhat leisurely pace. Remember, the Navy didn't want to do this anyway. In May 1911, before the bill approving the ships was signed, news about the Ottomans actually ordering the 2 dreadnoughts from British yards, armed with 13.5-inch guns, broke, and now it was finally time to panic. The Russians again got the date wrong, and the Ottomans did not order the ships until June, but still, they were being ordered, at least one of the proposed 2. Nevertheless, the Naval Ministry got kicked into gear, as they feared the Ottomans would launch a preemptive strike as soon as their dreadnoughts were complete. The Ottoman ships were not just dreadnoughts, but super dreadnoughts, meaning they were larger and more powerfully armed than the first-generation dreadnoughts the Russians were building, so they began looking into upgunning the Empress Maria class. The Artillery Commission found that the difficulties of obtaining this armament, i.e. 14-inch guns, lay in the fact that the Obukovsky work is not in the position to provide the necessary number of 14-inch guns, 36 barrels, by the deadline stipulated by the MGSH for the completion of these vessels, the 1st of January 1915, and this will delay the completion of the vessels by 1.5 years. They then looked into purchasing guns from abroad, Armstrong, Vickers, Coventry, Klopp, Skoda, and Schneider, but the Naval General Staff concluded that the 12-inch guns of the class were more than sufficient to handle the 13.5-inch guns the Ottoman battleships carried. After some thought about transferring the Sevastopol-class from the Baltic to the Black Sea and understanding its impracticality, the final design was set at 12-inch guns and a 21-knot top speed. Russian shipyards in the south of the country were chosen because few foreign firms wanted to take on the Russian ships. Many of the southern shipbuilding companies lacked experience and therefore relied on help from domestic and foreign shipbuilders like the Baltic shipbuilders and the British firm Vickers. Now, from reading up on Russian ship construction and the Navy as a whole, one gets the impression that the shipbuilding firms, naval staff, and the different fleets didn't get along too well. So in this competition, the first contract went to the Society of Nikolaev Works and Yards, or the Russian abbreviation ONZIV. In the new company, the Russian Shipbuilding Joint Stock Company, or RUSID, got the other contracts. The competition was pretty fierce from the different shipbuilders. Still, the new RUSID got the backing and financial support of the Imperial family, and so got the second bid along with help from the designers of the state-owned Baltic Works. These two were given preliminary orders in late August 1911. Once this was done, the two firms began working hard to complete designs, and throughout the autumn and winter of 1911, they competed with one another to get their ideas chosen. Unsurprisingly, the state-backed, more experienced RUSID/Baltic Works design won the competition, and the ships began being laid down in October 1911. There were provisions in the contracts for the 3 battleships to be made out of exclusively Russian material and equipment. This was quite ambitious, and so there was an escape clause to allow the firms building the ships to use outside help. RUSID used equipment from the British firm John Brown for some of the machinery. ONZIV used Vickers. Empress Maria was built in RUSID dockyards and was required that she and her sister Emperor Alexander III be complete by August 1915. She was 3 months late thanks to foreign help, which is pretty good all things considered. She was launched in October 1913 and had a displacement of 22,600 tons and an actual of 23,413. Her machinery consisted of 20 small tube boilers, giving steam to 4 turbines, with a design shaft horsepower of 26,000, and on trials, she had 33,200, giving her a real top speed of 21.5 knots. She had an armament of 12 12-inch or 305mm 52 caliber guns and 4 triple turrets along the center line of the ship, 25.1-inch or 130mm 55 caliber guns and casemates, and 4 underwater torpedo tubes. As for armor, she had a main belt of 262.5mm or 10.3 inches thick, which thinned out as it went forward and aft to 125mm or 4.9 inches, with bulkheads of 50mm or 2 inches thick, turrets with a face thickness of 250mm or 9.84 inches, sides and roofs of 125mm or 4.9 inches, barbettes of 250mm or 9.8 inches, and 125mm or 4.9 inches behind the upper belt. A conning tower with a maximum thickness of 300mm or 11.81 inches, and decks with a maximum thickness of 37mm or 1.46 inches. The construction of the ships went relatively quickly, considering the outbreak of the Great War in July 1914, which did hamper some of Empress Maria's sisters, as they could not get the material needed due to the war. It was also because of the war that the speed of the construction was increased, and some of the equipment intended for her sisters was given to her. Upon her completion, she began running trials in August 1915, which revealed some defects to the lubrication system of the starboard low-pressure turbine, but were otherwise satisfactory. It was also found that she trimmed badly by the bow. This meant that it hampered the secondary battery and, more critically, the handling of the ship. So reductions in the amount of ammunition carried by the 2 forward turrets and casemates, along with the shortening of the starboard anchor, helped somewhat. Throughout her career, she had many minor modifications aimed at improving the design and construction of the ship, like the removal of the paravane-like minesweeping equipment at the boom of the bow, which proved ineffective. or the addition of 75mm guns to the roofs of the turrets. Once trials and fitting out were complete in Sevastopol, the Empress Mariia and her sister's main opponents were not the British-built dreadnoughts as they had been taken into service by the Royal Navy, but the German battlecruiser Goeben and the cruiser Breslau, which had been given to the Ottomans by the Germans as they were forced to go to the Ottomans because the British chased them to Constantinople, which I will link to my video on Indefatigable to give you a better picture of the situation. I will be using their German names as it's a bit easier to pronounce than their Turkish names, which will appear on screen now. In part, they were still German ships, considering they were still crewed and commanded by Germans. Anyway, on October 29, 1914, Goeben and Breslau opened up hostilities between the Ottoman and Russian forces by bombarding Sevastopol. Breslau could be dealt with by Russian forces. Goeben, on the other hand, was a bit more than the pre-dreadnoughts of the Russian fleet could handle, at least alone. With their powerful 10 28cm guns or 11-inch guns and a 10-knot superiority in speed, the Russian pre-dreadnoughts were at a severe disadvantage. Since 1907, the Black Sea Fleet had been experimenting with techniques to defeat a dreadnought-type ship. They had come up with several for concentrating their gunfire of about 3 or 4 pre-dreadnoughts on a target, with the 3 best pre-dreadnoughts forming the core of this group and a reserve group in case something happened to another. So, before Empress Mariia and her sisters could enter service in 1915, the pre-dreadnoughts would have to hold their own against Goeben, doing so in mid-November 1914 when they battled Goeben in fog, where they caused serious damage to Goeben and came close to causing a detonation of the battlecruiser's magazine, according to some of her crew after the war and by Gary Staff's German battlecruisers of World War I. The German admiral in charge thought that he had bitten off more than he could chew facing so many Russian battleships, and so withdrew. Goeben continued to get more and more damage throughout World War I, and due to the lack of proper facilities in the Ottoman Empire, she became less efficient, especially after mine damage in December 1914. Another role Russian battleships played as the war in the Black Sea developed was coastal bombardment and anti-shipping sweeps along the Anatolian coast, causing more encounters with Goeben. The autumn of 1915 saw the Empress Mariia enter service and undertook her first combat mission on October 1st. She covered Russian pre-dreadnoughts and cruisers as they bombarded Turkish positions on the Anatolian coast. Once Bulgaria joined the war on the side of the Central Powers, Empress Mariia repeated her pattern of covering the pre-dreadnoughts, this time against Bulgarian positions near Varna. In December, the Black Sea Fleet received another dreadnought, the Empress Catherine the Great. However, she was almost torpedoed by a Russian destroyer in a classic case of misidentification, where in January 1916, for the first time, a Russian dreadnought faced Goeben, this being the Empress Catherine the Great. It wasn't too much of a fight, as Goeben only fired a few shells, while the Russian dreadnought fired close to 90 shells, causing some splinter damage to Goeben. Meanwhile, as the Russians advanced in the Caucasus, Empress Mariia was covering them in her usual guard duty. In April, she almost had Breslau in her clutches. However, the German cruiser got away through hugging the coast, where the German captain sent a rather curt message, the German equivalent of, pardon my French, "kiss my ass." In reply to this, the Empress Mariia opened up and began straddling her. Nothing of note happened between this point and her destruction, besides attempting to chase down Goeben in July, and the appointment of Alexander Kolchak to the command of the Black Sea on account of the failed chase with Goeben. The Empress Mariia was in Sevastopol in late October 1916. Something was amiss, though. To quote Russian and Soviet battleships by Stephen McLaughlin, at 6:20 a.m. on October 20th, 1916, a sailor passing by the forward turret heard a hissing sound. Within seconds, smoke and flame began issuing from hatches and ventilators near the turret and from the embrasures of the turret itself. The alarm was sounded and fire hoses unreeled, but before anything could be done, the ship suffered a powerful explosion. Flames were observed shooting almost 1,000 feet into the air. The conning tower, foremast, and forward funnel were all blown over the side, and the forward turret was displaced. Perhaps as many as 100 men were killed or wounded by the blast. Through the shattered upper decks, fires could be seen raging below. A brave group of sailors led by the engineer-mechanic Mishmin Ignatiev managed to flood the forward magazine, and sadly all were lost, probably saving the ship from further catastrophic explosions. Further flooding of the other magazines was ordered as a precaution. A string of smaller explosions continued after the first larger one. Just as the reeling crew thought they had the situation under control at about 7 a.m., the ship was rocked by another explosion almost as powerful as the first, destroying portions of the underwater hull. The ship began taking on water rapidly. With most of her forward bulkhead destroyed, it was impossible to stop the flooding. By 7:12, the stem post was submerged, and the ship was taking on a definite list to starboard. Within 4 minutes, as water poured in, the ship fully capsized at 7:16. Another 4 minutes passed, and by 7:20, the ship was fully underwater, taking 227 men down with her. Within an hour, the Russian Black Sea Fleet had lost one of its most powerful battleships due to an internal explosion. Like other ships that suffered catastrophic explosions that we've covered, like the British battlecruisers at Jutland, HMS Vanguard, Glatton, and so on, an investigative committee was set up. The committee came up with 3 possible causes for the fire and subsequent explosion. Let me know if they sound familiar. 1. Spontaneous combustion of powder charges. 2. Carelessness in the handling of fire or powder charges. 3. Sabotage. The committee thought the first possibility most likely, spontaneous combustion. It was not unheard of. Again, quoting McLaughlin here, it occurs because the nitrocellulose used in such propellant releases nitric acid over time, and unless something is done to neutralize this acid, it will react with the nitrocellulose, causing it to ignite. Stabilizing agents are used to neutralize the acid. However, they deteriorate over time, and the powder can decompose at a fast rate. The Commission noted several deficiencies with the magazine arrangements, along with known problems in the cooling system and spraying system. The latter did not apparently cover the projectile magazines. Certainly an interesting area not to cover. The second possibility, carelessness, was determined to be less likely as no one was handling the ammunition at the time. However, the day prior, messy conditions were reported in the magazine. Given that it was 1916 and the military situation in Russia was rapidly worsening and discipline was lax, it certainly could happen. Perhaps a workman dropped a cigarette or some other source of fire, and it smoldered throughout the night and only reached dangerous proportions the following morning. A possibility that is not unheard of, and perhaps in conjunction with the first theory, it could have created the right conditions for such an explosion to occur. When it comes to the last possibility, sabotage, it is only natural in wartime to suspect sabotage. It was only exacerbated by the violent revolutionary conditions. Security aboard the ships was lax. No form of identification was required for the workmen coming on and off the ship, and no count of their number was even kept. A German agent could sneak on board and plant explosives in the battleship, but the workmen were all known to one another, and a stranger coming aboard unnoticed seemed unlikely, at least to the committee that was set up to investigate this disaster. Now, a revolutionary among the workmen was possible, but why would they want to blow up a ship? The revolutionaries were far more interested in converting the sailors to their cause than blowing up a ship that the prospective converts were serving on. So in the absence of evidence of sabotage and negligence, spontaneous combustion of propellant charges is the most likely cause of the disaster. However, there are reports online discussing Soviet trials during the 1930s about German agents and their possible involvement in the 1930s. Due to the lack of corroborating evidence, I've chosen to leave this out of the video for the most part. I've also seen speculation online that the explosives could have been related to the machinery, and specifically the boilers. An interesting theory, however, from the evidence, it seems the explosion took place too far forward for that to be the case. The loss of the Empress Maria did not initially appear to be that big of a deal, as the Russians had 1 dreadnought in service and 1 close to completion in the Black Sea. Still, work on raising the sunken ship began before the end of 1916. They decided to raise her bottom up, repairing the hull and then taking her into deeper water and righting her, with that last part of the operation being ambitious and not exactly clear on how that was to be done. In November 1917, the undamaged after portion of the hull was brought to the surface. Work continued for several months, with compartments being sealed over time, and divers unloaded her ammunition. By May 1918, the ship was raised and brought to the northern dockyard, still upside down. The 130mm guns were taken out, and the turrets had all fallen out while the ship was being raised. No further work was carried out. Considering the situation in the former Russian Empire, it only makes sense. By 1923, nothing had been done still, and the supports holding the ship were rotting away, and the dock was damaged. so the capsized hull was dragged out and left in shallow water near the bay's entrance. She remained there until 1926, when she was brought back into the repair dock, this time for scrapping. Her turrets were raised and put into service near Sevastopol, playing an active part in the city's defense in 1941 and 1942. Out of the dreadnoughts built for the Russian Navy, Empress Maria, to me, has the most interesting history given her demise. Although not as well known as the Sevastopol-class, the Empress Maria class as a whole were interesting ships, and I hope to cover them more in the future, which is why the development portion is a bit lacking, as I want to discuss it more in future videos. Her fate still remains a mystery. Whether it was carelessness, spontaneous combustion, or sabotage is something we will likely never know. Let me know your thoughts down below. In any case, thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.